أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you for joining us once again in our series Life, the Islamic Answer. Our discussion was around the role of the intellectual in the Islamic community of knowledge. The last time that we met, we said that if we look at the literature, the scholarship in the Western world, as broad as it is, as rich as it is, and diverse as it is, there are three themes that emerge from the entirety of that corpus, from the entirety of that literature, that are extremely noteworthy for us, that are very relevant for us, and our discussion on the Islamic community of knowledge. And these three themes are power structures and the role of the intellectual within power structures. And then we saw the theme around, we called it critique or skepticism of the role of the intellectual. And we saw that that can be very broad. There are those who question, and there are those who go much further in their critique of the role of the intellectual, adding caveats, adding conditions, based on lived experience, based on what certain societies faced from certain intellectuals who perhaps did not live to the expectations, even though they had preached or they had presented values that are respectable, that are commendable. Eventually, they turn into situations, catastrophes, and this became lessons learned for those who were studying it after the facts. And we said, as much as there is some skepticism in certain cases around the role of the intellectual, some go much further in their critique of the intellectuals. And to be honest, as we said, those who have addressed the role of the intellectuals have mainly been critical and not entirely supportive of simply giving in to intellectuals in general, in a general sense. It always comes with conditions, it comes with warnings, and so on and so forth. And we explained some of the reasons around that. And then we also spoke about, as the last theme, the theme of the engagement. And to what extent should an intellectual be playing perhaps a social role, a political role, an engaged role, an activist role. All of this is hotly debated and has been since the figure of the intellectual became a prominent figure to be looked at and to be thought about in the West. So this is what we covered the last times that we met. Inshallah, all of this is very clear. Today, as we promised, inshallah, we want to start by looking at the counterpart to this entire discussion, this time by looking at what is going on in the Islamic world. And to be very honest with you, if we wanted to, there is a lot of breadth and a lot of depth that can be covered under this general heading of the Islamic world and the thinkers, the Muslim and the Arab thinkers who have addressed the role of the intellectual, the diversity of the opinions, and that by itself would warrant a long discussion for us to provide a comprehensive overview of that. And it is quite pertinent, quite relevant for us to do so, but we want to keep the series and this topic within the series as short as possible. So we really are going to focus in a very targeted way on some key notions and some key figures and some key works, either because of their importance, because of the novelty, the creativity, the seriousness of the thoughts and the ideas that they presented forward, or because they have become extremely influential in the Arab and the Islamic worlds. And as much as we want to focus on ideas in themselves and present the arguments as they are, as we said, part of this series is also to ensure that we are being exposed to those ideas that are worth being exposed to. So we're also trying to ensure that those who follow get a good overview of this topic and the discussions and the arguments and the themes that emerge out of it, as we said until now, in the Western world, and now we are going to focus on the Islamic world. So that at the end, at least those attending and listening to this series can say that they had a good, even very simple and quick introductory overview of the topic, and they know some of these names, some of these titles, some of these ideas, because for many of us, perhaps we have never been exposed to any of this before, and this really fast tracks us, inshallah, to accelerate our introduction to this type of topic and this type of thinking going on in the Arab and the Islamic worlds. So I think that's enough for the introduction. So maybe one last point before we start talking about some of the key figures and what they are presenting and some of the key themes in which they are reacting. A very quick reminder, and we presented a lot of this a few lectures ago when we started talking about the world events that took place that led to the emergence of the figure of the intellectual on both the Western side and specifically, particularly the Islamic side. So I don't want to repeat what we already said. I just want to focus on maybe 2 or 3 of these milestones, 2 or 3 of these big events in which the thinkers, those who are now looking at the role of the intellectual, are working. The reality is, today when we look at the literature, we saw how in the West we were able to bring it down to 3 themes. What we're going to see on the Islamic side is that we can bring it down to two main themes, or 2 types of thinking around the intellectual, the role of the intellectual in society. But to understand those 2 themes, especially the first one, which is the main one, we need to understand that context. It's as though these thinkers are reacting to something. They're not just simply thinking about, in a void, in a vacuum, just at a theoretical level, what is the role of the intellectual? The question is not, even sometimes though it may seem to be asked this way, once they start to get into the specific questions they are trying to answer, the ideas that they're reacting to, you start to see that this is clearly a reaction to something. The something are these historical, social, political events, milestones that took place, especially in the Islamic world. So this is simply to understand how all of this connects. And we bring it back to ourselves, of course, and we say, and we are not detached from this. This is not something that is completely irrelevant to us, from which we are completely disconnected. This is still part of, or an extension of, our heritage, the tradition, the culture that we have inherited. And it is part of the reality that we must all contend with and react to as well. So the events or the milestones that we talked about, and so a lot of this is repetition, so I'll go very quickly, starts with the Nahda. So we said that in the Islamic world, at some point, and if we want to bring it specifically to one event, there is one specific event that we can reference, which is the day when the people of Egypt woke up and they found Napoleon having invaded Egypt. And he stayed there as an invader for 3 years, in 1798. When they wake up and they are in that situation of having now been invaded under an occupying force that has come to them from Europe, the Muslims start to understand and to realize that they do not have what is required to resist this occupier. When they thought about it and they looked at it objectively, they felt that they are being dominated because of the technology, because of the weaponry, because of the military forces, the industry, the technology, and the knowledge that goes behind it, of a superior force in those dimensions. And so they started to study what they are exposed to, what they are having to deal with, to contend with. And they realize that not only are they superior in those dimensions, but they have a different way of administering the state, of administering the affairs. This causes a reaction, especially and starting from Egypt, but slowly spreading to the rest of the Islamic world. The reaction is that we need a revival. It does not make any sense for us as Muslims, those thinkers said, to have fallen back so far behind to the point where we are now being dominated in this way. We have to do something about it. And this movement of having to do something about having fallen so far behind is what is called An-Nahda, the Renaissance. So the Muslims wanted to create their own version of the European Renaissance, this time in the Islamic world. Except that we can see that now, whereas in Europe this happened naturally, now we are trying to mimic something that happened elsewhere. This is not something that just happened out of the blue in the Islamic world. They are now reacting very clearly to an external force, and the solution that they thought they would find, the model that they are going to replicate, was not an idea that they created themselves. They thought, well, the Europeans were able to revive themselves, to bring themselves back from a very regressive way of thinking and of administering their world into something a lot more based on rationality and knowledge and rights and so on and so forth. And that's what allowed them to now dominate us and become superior to us. So we are going to react to that. And this reaction to it was called An-Nahda, or the Renaissance, or the revival, or the awakening. So this is the beginning of the movement. So now, as we said, remember the dates, very early 1800s, and this continues until what is officially considered the failure of the Nahda movement in 1920. So this movement lasts about 120 years. And it takes different shapes, different forms, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So you're going to keep, inshallah, in mind these dates that we're talking about as we go through some of the names, and I'll try to always mention the dates associated with those names so that you can situate them within these major movements. That's one major movement. And so one of the main ways, and you're going to see it in the themes that we start talking about today, one of the main ways that the Muslims tried to implement, to execute this Nahda, is by reforming or modernizing the education systems. Because to them, this is where they were lacking. Had their education systems been a lot more robust, a lot better planned, then they would not have lagged behind to this point of being dominated by others. So we're going to start from the beginning so that the next generations, as they go into adulthood, they are in a much better state than we were. So we're going to focus on education systems. And this took two sides. The main side that most were focused on is the normal education system. Not everywhere did they have schools. There were very high levels of illiteracy. The curriculum that was used did not necessarily incorporate the things that you would expect and hope to see in an education system, the math and the science and so on and so forth. There's a focus perhaps just on history, on the language when it was taking place, and on some religious teachings. And so now there is a realization that we are now lagging behind and all of those other much more concrete, practical areas that we have to work on quickly, and we don't even have the curricula and the content to put into a curriculum to teach our children. So where do we find it? So a lot of them started to move towards thinking about what we can draw from the West, from Europe, to see what are they teaching. And here you start to see the movements that say we cannot just reject it all just because it's European or non-Islamic. There's certainly something beneficial here. They were able to reach certain advancements and to move much faster than us. And now they are superior in industry. They are superior in technology. So we have to at least go get that. That's beneficial. Let's teach it. That's one side. And then the second side was we have to look at Islamic education. And not just Islamic education as in what do you teach a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. But what do you teach the person who is becoming your religious cleric and scholar? What goes in that curriculum? Because those are the leaders of your society. So inshallah, when I talk about this, you're also seeing and drawing the linkages to our own realities, right? And so there's a whole movement that has to do with the reform of education. So I'll leave that. We're not going to talk about it in depth. Now you know, and you can take it where it needs to go in your mind. At the same time, within that movement of revival, there is a focus on the Arabic language. One, because of what it is and what it represents in the Arab world, its importance and its richness and its heritage and its symbolic stature. And so the importance of going back to truly understanding our Arabic language. But the second reason to do that is that this is going to unify all the Arabs. This is going to bring us all back together instead of being disparate, isolated, distinct little groups. By all of us focusing on something that is common to all of us, this forces us to unite. And then we can benefit from each other's strengths and we can work together. And this led to another movement called Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is the movement that brings together all the Arabs at a political level. And until today, there are those who talk about Pan-Arabism or Pan-Islamicism. Which is what? Which is that we come together and we work as one, regardless of the political borders between our countries. What defines me is that I am an Arab or that I am a Muslim, depending on whether we're talking about Pan-Arabism or Pan-Islamicism. What defines me is that I belong to this group and not that I belong to this specific political state called, Jordan or Egypt or Syria. Understood? So these movements start at that time. So reform movements for education, movements that have to do with the Arabic language, and this becomes a theme. And until today, this theme continues, but not in the same fervor and passion and strength as before. And then, with time, there was the counter movement to that, which is the rise of nationalism. There are those who say we look beyond our borders, and those who say, no, we're going to now start focusing on our own states. We're going to rebuild ourselves, and we can't just focus and take on everyone's problems. Let's focus on our own problems as a state. And so you see these movements start throughout the Islamic world as well. Then you have the official collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We talked about that. And we said that the Ottoman Empire had been falling for a long time. There was just an official time when they said it has completely crumbled. And then we have the end of the Nahda. And then there are two more events that take place. So the end of the Nahda, or the failure of the Nahda in 1920 after World War I, is already considered, I shouldn't have used the word right away, it's considered a failure. So if you have thinkers in the Islamic world or in the Arab world trying to think about the role of the intellectual, you have to understand that they are now reacting to a failure. There was the beginning of it, which is, it was already a failure. We were invaded. We lost militarily. We lost at the industrial level. We lost at the technological level. We lost at the military level. And so we tried to revive ourselves. And that revival was a failure. So now we are even more behind than we wanted to be when we were first invaded. So now they are working in that context. That's the psyche. Now we're around the 1920s. You fast forward to 1948. And we have the Nakba. Now you have a very well-known Arab culture, ethnicity, state, call it all of those things, the Palestinians, who are exiled forcibly from their lands as a result of the creation of the state of Israel. Hundreds of thousands. The entire Islamic world witnesses. The entire world witnesses, but we're talking about the Islamic world. The thinkers in the Islamic world, the thinkers in the Arab world. You see this happen, you understand what's going on, you're already trying to recover from failures, and this happens. And that's why it's called An-Nakba. This is yet another catastrophic failure. Now, this is one more failure we're working with. What is it that led us to this state of weakness, subjugation, being dominated to this point that you cannot do anything about anything? You have no agency, you have no power. Whatever others want to do to you, they can just do to you. This is the second milestone. The Nahda and its failure, the Nakba. Fast forward another 20 years, 19 years, and you have the Naksa. The Naksa is the term that was used to refer to the end of, it is called officially in history, they call it the 6-Day War. The war of Israel against 3 Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And Israel won and they lost. And you can go back in history and do your own analysis and see why is it that this is the outcome, what happened, and why was that the outcome. 1967, and Naksa. As an Islamic thinker, as an Arab thinker, an Islamic thinker, this is the context in which you are working. It's a context of failure upon failure upon failure. Even when there was an attempt to revive, an attempt at rebirth, attempt at renaissance, failure. So today when you start reading about the role of the intellectual, you realize that they are reacting to something, but not everyone is going to come back and explain to you all the history they're reacting to. The recent history that started in the 1800s. But the thinkers are reacting to this history. And that's why to me it's easy to say, you jump from book to book, cover to cover, you listen from conference to another about the role of the intellectual in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, after the Arab Spring and the Arab Fall and the Arab winter, and so on and so forth. They're all reacting to something. The something is this series of failures and this series of events, one after the other, that has put all this burden and all this weight on the thinkers to try to say, what do we need to do to reform ourselves? Alaykum as-salam wa rahmatullah. To reform ourselves, to bring ourselves not into the future, but into the present. There's a lot of catch-up work to do. It's like we have to find cures. We have to find remedies because we have a pathological state. We have a state of sickness that we need to heal. This is how they're writing. All the writing that you read clearly is reacting to something, and this is the something. That's why I call it the psyche of the Arab thinker, the Arab philosopher, the Islamic thinker, philosopher. This is what they have in mind. For many of them, they lived through some of this. For many of them, they have studied this in depth. And so now they're reacting to something very real. And that's why I started by saying, when the Islamic and the Arab thinkers and philosophers are writing about, thinking about the role of the intellectual, it's not just a theoretical intellectual exercise. They are reacting to something very concrete. They are trying to find a very real solution to a problem that they are experiencing, to an illness, a social illness that they are living, that they have studied for a long time. They know nothing else but this illness. This is their perpetual state. This is all they've ever known. So, the two themes, therefore, after all of this, the two themes, therefore, or the two types of works, if, of course, I'm reducing, there is a little bit more, but just like we did with Western literature and Western research on the role of the intellectual, we were able to bring them down to three themes, or three types, three approaches to looking at the role of the intellectual. We can do the same on the side of the Islamic and Arab thinkers who looked at the role of the intellectual, this time from two angles. We don't even have three. The first one is revival and reform. And now you understand why. They are reacting to something, and I would say that this is the dominant feature of what you find in the literature. And here, the differences and the distinctions between what you read, it's not about the what. They would all agree on all of this. The context from which they're starting, they all agree on. The purpose at the general level, at the high level, they all agree on. We need reform, or we need revival, or we need to find our place back in the world. Dignity and self-respect and true presence in the world and agency and so on and so forth. The difference is the how. So you have those, as we started to see, and you can come up with this even at a rational level, objectively, but this is actually what happened historically. You have those who started to say, well, the West seems to have done quite well for itself with what it has done, so all we need to do is simply replicate. Whatever they've been doing in the West has obviously worked for them. And so the manner in which we are going to revive ourselves, our societies, reform our religion, and so on and so forth, is to replicate, to mimic, to go towards what the West has, to bring it back, and to apply it with minor or major differences to our own societies, to our own reality. That's a whole current, that's a whole school of thought with every variant in there. And of course, you have the completely opposite side. Those who say, if this happened to us, it's because we forgot who we are. It's because we tried to be someone we are not, or we simply forgot what we're supposed to be, what our values are, what our identity is, our teachings are. So the solution is to go back to the past, to go back to what we used to have as Muslims, how we used to live as Muslims. And that's why one way of understanding what a Salafiyya and Salafism is. Who are the Salaf? You go back to the old way of doing things. Depending on how far you go, if you go a little bit less far in history, you have more traditional or traditionalist societies and models and systems. But in all those cases, you're saying, I reject what I am seeing on the other side, and I'm going the opposite direction. And the opposite direction is, I turn back to what I'm supposed to be, and here you have the variance. The variance is, I go back in the past, or I focus on the teachings of the religion. And I will find the solutions from the religion itself. So I am turning back to myself. I'm not looking outside. I believe that I have everything I need within the religion. I just haven't been able to extract it and to adapt it the way I'm supposed to. That becomes a school. And then there are those who say, no, the solution was simply to go back. The solution is what we had 14 centuries ago. The closer I can get to that, the more true and correct and right it is. I transplant, as they say. I take it as it is from 14 centuries ago and I bring it to today. They rode camels, I ride a camel. They wore their clothes in a certain way, I wear my clothes in that way. Okay, so this is where you start to see the differences and the foundations of these differences. And then, so as we said, there's the history and the past, and then those who focus on the religion. And here again, there are permutations. There are those who say within religion, I turn to religion now. Those who say, I turn to religion because it contains the answers. They're just there, point blank. They're right in your face if you were to look at them. You take it at face value and religion is telling you what to do. And then there are those who say, no, we have to dig in religion and reinterpret and find new ways of understanding this religion. So that becomes another school of thought. Which tools are you going to use to reinterpret religion? Are they internal to religion or external to religion? And what are the limits of you reinterpreting the scriptures, the evidence, the narrations, the Quran? To what extent can you interpret or reinterpret? Is it complete free-for-all? Or are there conditions that have to be met? Is there a limit to how far you go in your reinterpretation? Correct? And then we have externally. There's internally inspired interpretation. So you focus on the text itself. And then there are the externally inspired, this is what I'm calling them, it's not an official title, externally inspired reinterpretations. Including, for instance, I don't just focus on the text, on the verse, and try to find my solution within. The tool that I use is external to the religion. So for instance, I may use a tool that I call reason or rationality. Unless that tool that I call reason or rationality is entirely strictly based on more religion, which is not the case, then my reason is something outside of religion, what I consider to be rationality or reason. And we're going to see that. There are those who did that. And then there are those who went another way. These are two different schools of thought that we have to talk about without any detail. There's something in philosophy, or it's called critical historical reading, or historicity, which means that when you look at something that is happening in history, you cannot take it and use it to any other situation happening at any other time, because the conditions are different. You cannot say after the fact, you cannot come later in history and look at something and say that is wrong, because you were not there. And if you were to take all the conditions and all the circumstances that were in place at that time, then it was right for that time. But you can't take that reality and put it today, because it would be wrong today. It's ahistorical. This is what they would say, for instance, if you take a look at the theory of Aristotle in some scientific field. In his time, in his world, that theory made sense. It was consistent with the rest of the knowledge. And it allowed them to solve real problems in life. It provided real explanations that fit everything else that they knew at that time. Today it's easy for us to say, but the theory, the formula of Einstein is a lot more precise. It allows us to, but if you take that theory and bring it at the time of Aristotle, it would make no sense. Because for that theory to work, you need everything else around it. The worldview has to be different, or what they call the paradigm of that theory has to be aligned with that theory. The theory can't work by itself on its own. The idea, the notion of energy, did not exist at the time of Aristotle. The notion of mass and the notion of the speed of light did not exist at the time of Aristotle. You can't just transplant, as they say, take it as is and put it at another time. But that one made sense in its time, and this one made sense in its time. Which basically means that there are no universals in history. that there is nothing in history that could be universalized and generalized. And therefore, we have to reinterpret everything in religion from this point of view. And this is a reading in religion. And I'll mention one of the main names around it, but there are many. Muhammad Arkoun and many others like him. They push this way of understanding and interpreting religion. This is a very modernist or progressive way of looking at religion, as they say. So this is an external factor to allow us to modernize and reform Islam by not relying on tools within. You're now relying on external tools. These are tools that have come from Western research and Western scholarship and Western thinkers and philosophers. Another one, for instance, is everything that today is easily called hermeneutics. There are philosophers. There's a philosopher by the name of Heidegger, and then another one of his students, Gadamer, and they really went very far in this idea of interpretation or hermeneutics. And how subjective is it to understand something in the world and to understand something that you're reading? Can we really truly share the same understanding of anything? Whatever you're understanding also includes your whole life experience. And that's why you understand it in this way. Even though we may be listening to the same words, even though we may be reading the same thing, even though we may be applying the same rules, it will always be highly subjective. For instance, there's a lot more topics. I'm summarizing and giving examples. So now, if we take that and start to use it to religion, or to try to use it for understanding the religious experience and how subjective or individual it may be, of course, you can go very far in saying, for instance, what does it truly mean to say this is a revelation? What does it truly mean to say that this is something revealed by God through an angel to a human being? And what did the Muslims really understand from it at that time? And how did they apply it? Do we have to have the same exact experience of it? Is it even possible? And so there's a hermeneutical way of re-understanding religion. See, I'm giving you different angles. These are all external to religion. There's a historical one. There's a hermeneutical one. There's one based on rationality. And there are many others. I just want to focus on the big ones. Once you start to understand this, then it's very easy afterwards when you hear someone having a new idea or an interpretation about religion, a new theory. It doesn't take long for you to be able to situate where they are in this mapping. Right away you can say, are they traditionalist or not? If they are not, are they relying on internal or external tools? Are those tools in themselves valid or not? Have you ascertained, have you ensured that those tools that are using are valid? Is it valid? The historicity argument, is it a proper argument? Or does it have weaknesses? Can it truly be applied in the way that they are claiming? The hermeneutical argument, can it be applied the way that they are claiming? Or does it require some moderation? Does it require some conditions? Does it apply to a religious text or not? And so on and so forth. So all of this was to talk about the first theme that emerges from, or the efforts of those who have tried to move towards revival and reform. It falls in this general theme, this attempt. And the how is everything that we just described. The second main approach is one that is a lot more technical. And so this technical one is not the one that usually makes it to the masses. This is not what the majority of people talk about. This is more reserved to those who have specialized knowledge, because the discussion stops very quickly afterwards. It gets very technical very quickly. Those discussions, even though I used a lot of specialized terminology, you don't need the specialized terminology to talk about. So it makes it to the commoners and the masses, and everybody can talk about it. The second attempt at looking at the role of the intellectual in all of this, the second attempt is a little bit more technical because it focuses specifically on the role and the relationship between the intellectual and the faqih, or the intellectual and the specialist in religious knowledge. In that, in philosophy or in logic, we would say there's a dichotomy. It's only two things. It's a binary dichotomy, two things. There's the muthaqqaf and there is the faqih. The faqih is everyone who is the specialist in religious knowledge. And then there's everyone else. And the muthaqqaf falls in the everyone else. So what is truly the relationship there? Does the intellectual have any role to play in anything that religion has to say or teaches or orders? Is there any role? Is there any place for the intellectual in all of this? Or is it reserved to the faqih? And if there is any role, what is the role? What is the scope of that role? Are there limits? Are there conditions to that role? That becomes a much more specialist or specialized or technical discussion, because it becomes a discussion of fiqh and the limits of fiqh. Where does religion start and stop? And who is allowed to have a religious opinion? And what validates that religious opinion? So who is the intellectual and who is the faqih in all of this? So most people, you and I's of the world, would be very difficult for us to truly engage in this discussion unless we have a lot of this specialized knowledge, because this becomes a discussion of fiqh and usul al-fiqh, and we can't go really far in our discussion unless we have those foundations. And so you see that this discussion doesn't make it very far in communities and society because it requires more specialized knowledge. But generally speaking, if you were to take, 90% of books or articles addressing the question of the role of the intellectual in today's world, in society, in community, his relationship with religion, his place in religion, it would fall into one of these two big attempts. The first one is, how do we revive? How do we reform? How do we bring ourselves into the present? Because we seem to be lagging in the past. We're stuck somewhere in the past. And everything we explained, the context for that. Or it's a more theoretical discussion. What is the exact nature of the relationship between the non-specialist thinker and the religious authority figure? What is the relationship between those two? Do they complement each other? Are they in conflict? Is there supposed to be any relationship or not? Is there any space for anyone outside of the ones representing officially religion to be working in the religious space? And so on and so forth. Okay, those are the two main approaches and main efforts that you find in the whole field. So it's a little bit less diverse, a little bit more targeted, pointed as discussions. But within that, there is an incredible breadth and depth of opinions and scholarship and research and ideas and theories. So with that, I think we can start with some of the attempts at the how. So the way I'm going to do it is to simply start, so that, as we said, we force each other to learn about some of these thinkers, some of their works, and at the same time understand how in detail all of this was applied. And if there's a lot more interest, we can go a lot deeper than this. This is a very quick overview. So in terms of the how, and if we follow a little bit of the timeline that we presented, the beginning, there are earlier thinkers. There's Rifa'a al-Tahtawi that I should probably start with. And I don't even remember if I added any lines for al-Tahtawi or not. I do not believe I did. I'll talk about him in the future, inshallah. Rifa'a al-Tahtawi was an Egyptian cleric, scholar, and he was one of those who put really, truly a lot of energy and effort into reforming, modernizing the education systems in Islam. So he has the background of a cleric, and so he worked on both sides, but his main focus was on the normal education system. And his approach, so we're talking early 1800s, his approach is that since the West, since the Europeans have been able to achieve such achievements, such accomplishments, then certainly they are doing something good, something right. And there is a lot of benefit in trying to see what that is. We need to study what they do, and whatever we find beneficial, we take, and it's okay to replicate. And whatever we find harmful, we leave aside and we do not incorporate. Okay, that's kind of generally his main activity and his main efforts in the early 1800s. Then you have a series of scholars who all affect each other, who all work together at different times, who emerge especially in Egypt. When one of them, who was born in 1838, Sayid Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, he traveled a lot in the Islamic world. He reaches Egypt. And he is a man who is, I'm going to use terms loosely here, we would say obsessed with, extremely passionate about this idea of reform, of having to push ourselves forward to catch up to the present with everything that requires. He worked at the political level, at the social level, at the educational level. And he worked with a number of others too, who started to believe in his drive and in his ideas and in his way of working. And he was extremely energetic and extremely prolific, with connections and well-traveled, well-spoken, a huge network of people who associate with him, and he works at all levels in this way. So Sayid Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, very influential reformer. Then you have two who go usually together. One of them mentioned oftentimes a lot more than the other, Sheikh Muhammad Abdu in Egypt. So he's born 1849, he dies in 1905. And he has a student who works with him very, very closely, who is Rashid Rida, the student of Muhammad Abdu. Today, by the way, many of us, we have Nahj al-Balagha. You will see that it has a commentary of Muhammad Abdu. It's a well-known, most famous version of Nahj al-Balagha. It's his tahqiq and his explanation. He was a very influential, very famous Azhari sheikh, an Azhar, full traditional scholarship from Azhar, with time, with a lot of critique to the traditional way of teaching and forming these shuyukh, these clerics. So he was focused on having to reform the education system that produces the sheikh and the imam and the cleric and the scholar. And a lot more, and we're going to talk about this. Let's just say who these people are. And then in 1906 to 1966, you have the life of Sayid Qutb. Sayid Qutb, who was another influential Islamic thinker, and at the very summit of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, or Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So extremely influential figure, prolific author, and his works spread like wildfire in the Islamic world. So he became even more influential throughout the Islamic world, especially at the political level. The idea of reviving Islam and being engaged politically to do so. Okay, and of course the fact that he was martyred, he was executed by the Egyptian state, further made his name famous and popular, and people followed him and read his works and so on and so forth. And he's very influential until today, by the way. So he was executed in 1966. So the main ideas here is that first, and this is something that you will continue to find until today. So once you have the main arguments, you can see how the argument evolves with time, or is presented with some variants, with some modifications, but the argument remains the same. So there's a whole idea in these works that you see at that time having to do with fighting colonialism, resisting to the outside external forces, resisting any domination, renewing the civilization of Islam. Islam is its own civilization and it needs to be renewed. Rejecting Western influence outright. Challenging secularism. Explaining that Islam is what offers the alternatives to the Western solutions. The West has presented solutions to problems. They say that Islam presents alternatives, better alternatives to the solutions presented by the West, including its ideologies and its worldview. So this is where the focus was. Another set of ideas has to do with the idea of Islamic unity and pan-Islamicism. So we talked about it, now you see it in time. Unless we are smart enough and wise enough to work as one unit, we will continue to fail. That's the main idea here. And then they go to great lengths to show how a lot of the division within Islam is in fact created by external forces. Because that's how they were able to bring the Ottoman Empire to its knees. And that's how they are able to dominate the Islamic world and so on and so forth. That's what you find in their literature. Focus on modernizing education in general, and focus on modernizing Islamic education specifically. And when you have someone as well educated by the Azhar as Muhammad Abdu who writes this, then of course it goes a long way. Because he knows what he's talking about. He has the full formal education from Al-Azhar. He was a teacher and so on and so forth. Reforming Islamic thought by introducing as much as possible, of course they don't consider this external to Islam, they say this is Islam itself, is a rational system. So we have to cleanse Islam from anything that is irrational. And by the way, this is, if you read Tafsir al-Manar is a tafsir that presents a very rationalistic approach to everything that is mentioned in the Holy Quran. When the Holy Quran talks, for instance, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Fil, sending His wrath, His punishment to the people who attacked Al-Kaaba. أرسلنا عليهم طيرا أبابيل ترميهم بحجارة من سجيل. There's a reading of this that seems clearly miraculous. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is destroying an army with these little birds who are carrying little pebbles. Whatever those pebbles may be made of, or. This is not something that you typically encounter. And so, one rationalistic interpretation of this would be, for instance, that they are attacked by mosquitoes. And those mosquitoes are carrying malaria. And all of them end up dying very quickly as a result of a very common disease. And that would be a non-miraculous, rationalistic explanation for something that Muslims have traditionally interpreted in a miraculous way. And so whenever we are able to provide a rationalistic explanation to something, we should do so and rid religion of everything that is non-rationalistic. Okay? We're not saying this is right or wrong. I'm explaining the approach. And so, by the way, for people who are interested in the theories of tafsir and the schools of tafsir, if you read Tafsir al-Mizan of Sayid Tabatabai, he often spends a lot of time making a point to say, and this was a miraculous act from God. And to say that it was not so is not acceptable because of A and B and C and D, as some have claimed. But he doesn't say who. He is reacting to Tafsir al-Manar of Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdu. Right? Because of its influence, especially at that time. But this has become a whole school of thought, and of course it was replicated by many others. But unless you know this, you don't know what he's reacting to. It just seems that he's just trying to make a point that this is a miraculous act of God. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making a point to say, I intervene directly in this world. I'm present and I can perform miracles at any time. In fact, it's all miracles. Right? In any case. So, this is all to say they are, as part of what they promote, they say that there is a rationalistic aspect to our religion, intrinsic, it's already part of Islam that has been missing. And this has also been part of the reason why we are lagging behind. We need to come back to reason. Our religion is a rational system. Let's go back to reason and explain everything through reason. Then we have integration with modern knowledge and specialization. They say that we have no choice today but to spend time studying, for instance, things in chemistry, in physics, and biology, to build the machines, to be able to do certain things. This is very modern specialization, technical knowledge that I need to go and acquire. I can't rely on history. I can't study poetry for this. I have to be the one acquiring this. There used to be a time where the Islamic world was ahead of everyone else in these fields. And they were learning from us. They would come to the Islamic centers to learn industry and technology, to learn the natural sciences. And now we are behind. So let's go and make sure that whatever education system we have also incorporates as much as possible from modern knowledge and specialization. There's an emphasis in their writings on the difference between Islamic values versus Western values. So that while we understand that they may be more advanced technologically, industrially, and so on and so forth, the worldview, the angle from which they look at the world is fundamentally different. The values which drive each one of these systems are fundamentally different. And so they emphasize in their writings that as much as we want to take, as much as we want to be inspired by what is beneficial from them, let's not fall into the trap of starting to accept their values, because their values are, and this is the main point, based on materialism. And ours are not. And then, so this is what they call the re-Islamization of society. That we need to look at our societies and make them Islamic again. So how do we make them Islamic? We have to go and look at the systems that we need. For instance, we have a political system. We have a legal system. We have an economic system. And so you start to see very clear attempts in their writings where they start to talk about the current system that is dominant in Europe is capitalism. And here are the problems with capitalism, and here's how Islam resolves those problems in a different way. It provides a solution to these real problems. And a solution that is not based on the materialistic and materialist worldviews and values and ethics of the West. That's what they push. And you see this trend continue, by the way. I'm sure that your mind is already thinking of examples of how that evolved. Okay? And then you have, and this was Muhammad Abdu especially, because he comes from that background, calls to modernize fiqh. That the way we do fiqh has to change. We need a more modern fiqh. We need a fiqh that speaks to the people, day to day, to their realities, not a fiqh for the books. We need a fiqh that matches the realities of people. Okay, so this set of thinkers, this group of thinkers, we have to take them all together. And in fact, we could spend a lot of time just talking about the journal that they started. Al-Manar was a journal. And it lasted many years. And there are many, many studies on that journal and went into that journal. There's master's and PhD theses on this journal. And how influential it became in the world. To the point where many other groups in the world, for instance in Russia, for instance in China, they tried to replicate the experience of this journal, the Manar journal, in their own societies, in their own languages. In some cases, they would take content and simply translate it. In other cases, they would try to replicate the same themes and the same ideas that are being... So everything that I just talked about, these are the types of articles that you would find on a regular basis being published by these types of authors, by these thinkers specifically, and many others who contributed to Al-Manar. And then Muhammad Abdu started his own tafsir of the Quran, and then he passed away before finishing it. So his student, Rashid Rida, continued and finished his teacher's tafsir, and it was called Tafsir al-Manar. Again, In any case, there's a lot more to say here. I'll stop here. And I promised that today I wouldn't. Last lecture, I gave a double lecture. It was very long. So today, inshallah, we stop here. Inshallah, with this, we have at least a general understanding of the context in which the Islamic thinkers were working, were writing, what they were reacting to. And we're starting to see some other efforts, the how, what they are actually presenting. And all of this, we're going to see, is directed at the role of the intellectual in society. In all of these cases, they are talking about the intellectual leading these types of activities, leading these types of social, political, religious movements in society. And so here, in what we talked about today, you see that they start talking about the importance or the necessity for the intellectual, for instance, to influence the clerics and to be fully present with an Islamic mindset, so that I introduce into the Islamic society, for instance, industry, scholarship, natural science, and so on and so forth. But the drive and the project in which I'm working is an Islamic project. It's not in a vacuum. I'm not just doing my work as an engineer or as a teacher of chemistry or a worker in industry. I'm doing this as part of a project to reform or to modernize or to revive Islamic society, which is now lagging. And this is what I'm doing to contribute to its revival. Okay, so inshallah, a lot more details will come, and then we'll start going through many of the other thinkers. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله يخليكم وأنتم. الله يحفظكم. Questions, concerns, comments? تفضلوا.
So these group of thinkers that we mentioned today,
Yeah.
they were based in Egypt. But how far would their influence have gone? Were parts still controlled by the Ottoman Empire at the time, or for other parts who were under British influence or nomadic areas? Were they thinking about the same things, or was it centralized mostly in Egypt?
So in their time, it started from Egypt, but quickly there are others who started to replicate. What happened in Egypt was perhaps more than what happened elsewhere, especially because the sudden appearance of Napoleon in 1798. But the domination by Europeans of the Middle East, of the Islamic nations, all of that was the same everywhere. And it had started before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but it became very clear after. Because the Ottoman Empire in its last couple of 100 years basically was strong in some areas and very weak in others. And so as soon as there was weakness, and that weakness resulted in different things. In some areas, the weakness led to those, and it became weak because certain areas wanted to separate. They didn't want to remain under the Ottoman Empire because they felt it was being mismanaged, it was taking too many taxes from them, and. They felt that and this is a general consensus today, the Ottoman Empire was not managed very well. And a huge part of the reason is that it seems to have had what they call expansionist desires, which is they always want to be bigger. So they're always in a situation of at war, trying to expand their geographic domination over areas. And they had stretched themselves too thin, and the Ottoman Empire was filled and riddled with all sorts of issues internally. So instead of dealing with their own issues, they were just focused on military campaigns that they couldn't fund. And so what they would do is to go to areas that had a bit more wealth, had a bit more resources, to try to fund their military campaigns. And those areas were not benefiting from those campaigns in any way. And so with time, a lot of those areas wanted to separate from the Ottoman Empire. They felt they get nothing in return, and all they get is a loss of resources. And so there's a lot of, this is one example, there's many other examples. And so this led to some areas in the Ottoman Empire becoming a lot weaker and starting to be under the domination of other forces even before the fall. But officially with the fall, that's it. It was very easy afterwards to start splitting it into the different dominant forces. And that's exactly what you find when you hear today that they talk about something like Sykes-Picot and how they drew the borders, the political borders between countries, and they said, this is Iraq and this is Jordan, and we're going to put puppet regimes that are respected by the people, those populations that are loyal to us, and we're going to keep them in place, otherwise they wouldn't be able to remain there. Well, that was right on the heels of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so all of these states were feeling the same thing. They were all under domination one way or another. Maybe it was not Napoleon's domination, but one way or another, they felt the domination and they were all looking for solutions. And now suddenly there seemed to be movements. And by the way, there were many other movements. It's only that they were not to this degree famous, popular, well-known, studied until today, looked at academically, and so on and so forth. There are things that happened in Iran. There are things that happened in Iraq. The revolution, as they call it, the revolution of the tobacco, and all of that falls under this one way or another. Except that in Egypt, what seems to have happened is a actual intellectual movement, or today we would call it a project, which is different than saying, we're just randomly reacting to something that is external to us. There's an external force and we have to resist it. Okay, is there a strategy? Is there a way that you're doing this? Is this measured? Is this thought about? Is this something that you're going to do in 2 weeks or you're going to do in 10 years? What tools are you going to use? What's your approach? And what is your end state? What does it look like? This was what the Egyptians, or what was happening in Egypt, this is why it was distinctive. Because it looked like it was being well thought out. There was a project and there was an actual movement that was political, social, religious. There's a reason why some of these movements become so popular. Because the people living there feel like this is going somewhere and it will eventually help us all. And we can believe in this and we can stand behind it. It's not just random. And so this is perhaps why it was considered much more successful and it became the model to replicate elsewhere. And it spread quite quickly. And at that time, there was radio. And at that time, there was news. And at that time, news did travel. Not everything was instantaneous, but, even TVs were appearing. So people knew what was happening. It was a very, very major event in the world when Sayid Qutb was executed. Okay, so that tells you that we were already in a context, a social, political, religious context where news was traveling and that model was being replicated elsewhere, but it was still considered a model to be followed, and it was followed. Were there others? Yes, there were others. Were they doing their own thing? Yes, they were. But it never became as popular, as famous to others as this model became. And I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more details that we can say, but we leave it to another time, inshallah.
There's a lot of different fields that Islam teachers would have to get into and dissect to try to have their own input in it. One of the major things is like in the economic theory. You have communism and capitalism, the two major thoughts. Capitalism more dominant now, but you have for the Islamic world or the Islamic thinkers, is it easier? Because how far the economic system has grown and entrenched itself in terms of into society is far more advanced than you'd have, let's say, 14 centuries ago, that you can just take, copy, paste. It's impossible to do that. But is it easier, or is it for the intellectuals, would it be like taking model of like capitalism and instead of making it materialistically centric, making it spiritually centric, if it's even possible? Or do they have to go and reconstruct an entire thought and theory in terms of how to implement this? Like, I don't know, like to say the Sadr tried to do. I don't know, and what are the limitations on it? Why not? It's not getting implemented. Also, possibly because there's a lot of dominant forces and so on and so forth to stop that. One of the things, but is it or is there two different thoughts? What is the approach
take it and re-engineer it into our own worldview, or to reconstruct it into something that works best and maybe even better and export it all at that point.
Yeah, so the question, if it's not heard, is it better, or to what extent should we be replicating a system with modifications to make it more Islamic, as opposed to creating a new system entirely from scratch? And especially the example that you used is the economic system, with the experience or the project of Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, Allahi rahmah. We can't really answer this question. Each one of us, if we study it, we may come to a different conclusion. The point is that we are supposed to create the most Islamic version of those systems, especially if we believe that there's something fundamentally wrong. It's not that, we prefer another system. If someone like Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr is spending time and effort to try to come up with a Islamic version of economy, of an economic system, it's because he thinks that it's not just that there's something wrong with those systems, it's that it's so fundamentally wrong that it goes against what Islam is trying to do in the world. It's a counterforce. It's destructive. So it leads to oppression, it leads to wars, it leads to things that Islam does not tolerate, does not want to see. So in those cases, yes, I have to go out of my way to find the solution. The issue is I may differ with you on what the solution looks like, and that's perfectly fine. To each and their ability to do the research and present the best arguments, because none of this is going to be something where you find, you can open the Quran and find a verse that tells you this is the system. You're going to have general principles. And depending on how you apply those general principles, you end up with, in one version you might say, okay, this is good, but we have to change this, and that to make it Islamic. Otherwise, there is good in it. There's something salvageable. Or you say, just start from scratch. Don't even try to fix something like this, because it's fundamentally anti-Islamic. I don't want to say un-Islamic, anti-Islamic. So you start from scratch, from the beginning, so that the values you base the theory on or the system on are Islamic from the beginning. It's just a lot easier. And in today's world, of course, the economic system has gone and infiltrated so much more of our aspects of life that, of course, it is that much more difficult to dislodge the system and to provide a sustainable, practical solution for people to live in. It would be a miraculous feat, or close to be able to produce a system that would be able to replicate. So it might make more sense to start from within and to see what you can fix from within, as opposed to starting from scratch. Yeah, but good luck on both. There's a lot of work to be done. تفضل.
In terms of the Shia contributions to the whole Reformation, would you say that the battles that they had in the 18th century or the 19th century, the Sunnis and the Ikhwanis and Sheikh Al-Hasany and the proposal of Usul Fiqh and formulation of that science, would you say that that's parallel to the Egyptian experience to bring, again, more rationality into the religion, or at least have external resources to leverage external resources, aql, lugha, in order to be able to deduce ahkam from the Quran and so on and so forth? Would you say that's along the same trajectory?
Good question. So yes, there were definitely back and forths between the Akhbaris and the Usulis in the Shia world, in the Shia societies, and perhaps it can be considered replicating what we're finding in elsewhere, in trying to introduce perhaps external elements such as rationality into religion. Both the Akhbaris and the Usulis in the Shia world were politically active. On both sides, I shouldn't say that. I should say on both sides you have politicals or very prominent figures who are politically active. and you were also finding those on both sides, Ikhbaris and Usulis, figures who not only were not politically active, but who were against political activism and engagement. But both were politically active on both sides, and sometimes they actually had, agreement. Akhbari and an Usuli might agree politically on the next thing to do, even though they might disagree on religiously the foundation for doing it, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to say next is in no way trying to reduce or say that there was no political activity going on or that they were disconnected from this. Those who were engaged were very aware of all of this. It just does not look like, based on existing literature in their own books, that anything in those conflicts was related to that attempt or reacting to, trying to modernize and revive. It was going back to, things that were introduced perhaps centuries ago that ended up becoming the school of Ikhbariyya and the school of Usuliyya. And that battle was just continuing. It's an intellectual battle that continued in that way. Otherwise, it's difficult for me, I would say. I am not aware of any instances where clearly the attempt was being made as a result of or in reaction to trying to modernize and reform. No one did that, because I think it's much more fundamental than that. This is how religion is supposed to be done. Even though they all seem at some level to be saying the same thing, the how is different, and how they achieve that same thing. And you end up having what is called Ikhbari and Usuli. And in some cases, the difference between them has been exaggerated. And in some cases, the differences are very clearly there too. I don't know if I answered.
So
but
it's just happy coincidence that this happened around the same time. I think Sheikh Al-Hasany was 1800s.
Yes. Yeah.
And, but maybe it speaks to the maturity of perhaps that line of scholars or scholarship that they've noticed the problem for a long time and finally put an end to it. Or
in any case where there is, let's say, intellectual conflict between different sides, it would be naive to only look at the intellectual dimension and ignore the political and social dimension around it. That often contributes to one side rising and one side not rising. One side being more supported by the masses than the other side. One side suddenly becoming more powerful or taking control over resources or. There's always more than just the intellectual discussion. And so, of course, there was a lot of that happening. And we have to look at, who was in power at that time in those lands, and who were they closer to, and who was associated with who, and who was married to who, and so on and so forth, to fully understand how things evolved. And how one day, one group may seem to be dominant, and then the next day, the counterpart dominates. And sometimes it seems almost random. And sometimes no, there's also a lot of socio-political context around it that means that this group goes up and this group goes down. Yeah. Good question. اتفضلوا. Yes. So the question is, in the context of the Islamic community of knowledge, what is the difference between the faqih and the intellectual? To be honest with you, this is one of the questions we're trying to answer through this series. The way we defined it, but we said this is simply our working definition. This is a definition that we're giving ourselves permission to use because this represents our own reality. We're simply saying that the faqih is the person who has the specialized expert knowledge of Islamic disciplines, of Islamic sciences. And the intellectual is everybody else. So anyone who is interested in intellectual activity, let's say I'm someone who wants to think about how our community should function, and I want to contribute to it, and I want to be active in it, I am an intellectual. Unless I happen to have spent my life studying this religion and having become an expert in it, then I'm not an intellectual. There's an intellectual dimension to it, but I'm an expert and I'm an authority in my religion, right? So that's how we're defining the faqih versus the non-faqih. And the non-faqih can be anyone else, and this is how we define the intellectual. So we don't want to be elitist and say the intellectual is the person who lives in the academic world, or the intellectual is the person who has education, or the person who has credentials, or the person... This is not the intellectual. The intellectual is anyone who is willing to engage intellectually, especially for our purposes, in the affairs of the community. Do you want to think about? Do you want to have something to say about how the community functions, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to be structured, how we're supposed to have planning and foresight and strategy and so on and so forth? You're an intellectual. That makes you the intellectual. And the more you do that, the more intellectual you are in that context. Of course, you and I may not bring the same package to the discussion. Maybe you bring a package based on a very thorough understanding of how a community works, and you have a lot more foundations in religion than I do, and I come at it from a completely different point of view. I'm a businessman who understands the world of money, and I can only contribute to that side, whereas you're looking at it from 7 other sides, but we're both intellectuals, right? So everybody might bring a completely different dimension or contribution to it, but how we're defining things and to make it real for our communities, Islamic communities, we're saying there is someone who is an expert in religion and someone who is not. The expert in religion is the faqih. Everybody else falls in the potential category of being an intellectual if they choose to be. It's open to anyone, right? If you choose to engage intellectually, then you're somewhere on this spectrum. You may be an intellectual. Clear? تفضل.
A little bit similar to one of the previous questions, but my question is when you look at the big Shia thinkers at that time and the centers of knowledge, were they also engaging in the same topics? Were they also thinking how do we revive ourselves, or were they living in their own separate world and not really engaged in the same aspect as the Muslim world?
So the question is whether in the Shia world we were seeing the same type of preoccupation and reaction to the need to reform and to revive the Islamic nation or the Islamic world. At those specific times, you have some thinkers, very, very few, but very prominent in the Shia world, who had that much broader perspective. And you can see it. There are some of our scholars, for instance, who are writing letters back and forth with Sayid Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani. So, of course, you can see that this is the type of person that would want to talk to them, and this is the type of person that they would want to talk to, right? Because they are sharing common concerns and common preoccupations. Would we say that this is, generally speaking, the preoccupation of the Shia world at that time? I think that would be an exaggeration to say. We have some very prominent figures who appeared and who were a lot more engaged than others. But they were individuals. And it's difficult to say, just like in the Sunni world, it's difficult to say the Sunni world was. You have prominent figures, and those are the ones we're highlighting, and we're going to slowly turn away from, everybody is engaged at some point, Islamically speaking. Everybody is reacting to Islam and the place of Islam in today's world. But the majority of the names that we're going to mention are not going to be clerics. They're not going to be scholars. We're going to be looking at much more at the thinkers from outside of. They are intellectuals who are engaging about the role of the intellectual and who did things, who lived a life. Example, Sayid Qutb. Example, Al-Afghani. Example, Muhammad Abda. They lived these principles that they taught. They traveled, they sacrificed, they wrote, it was a project, it was a life project, an engagement and activism for them. Not simply, I'm going to put an idea out there. I think I have a theory, on this that I'm going to present, and I go back to living my life. So this is what we're interested in a little bit more, and also the most influential of these figures. And so in a lot of cases, if we look at clerics, we're going to see that they're a lot more concerned with their clerical duties, right? Their preaching and their religious activities, and not so concerned with, the intellectual aspect of all of this. But were there figures? There were some figures, yes. But I wouldn't be able to say that this is, generally speaking, how the Shia world was feeling or reacting to. As I would not say that about the Sunni world either. Yeah. Everybody feels what is happening. Everybody to some degree understands that failures have happened. But people go on living their lives. And we're focused on those who made this a life project to deal with this issue specifically, or had something significant to say about it. And those are much, much fewer, of course. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.